everybody. Welcome back to English 112, and this is for our class for Tuesday, the 9th of February, where we are discussing short story. And where we left off last class is I had asked you to consider how the surname of Mallard might be important in relation to the story of an hour. And I also wanted to talk about A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner. And in relation to the story of an hour, it was written in 1894. So it was a completely different world, particularly in terms of the rights or the lack of rights that women had. Women were viewed as property when they were married. They were not allowed to vote. They were not allowed to have their own incomes. So while we talked about some of these ideas with A Sorrowful Woman, it was a very different kind of experience for someone like a Mrs. Mallard. And the author, Kate Chopin, was known for being a feminist writer and oftentimes talking about female and the role of female in society. So if you've got some experience with Kate Chopin, perhaps her most famous work is entitled The Awakening, in which a woman experiences an awakening. It happens to be a physical and sexual awakening in addition to an intellectual and an emotional awakening. The book was considered to be so scandalous at the time that it basically led to her being blacklisted in her career. And actually, when I say book, I'm a little bit generous. It's really a novella, which is something that we really haven't talked about in class. Something that is longer than a short story, but that isn't quite as long to be classified as a novel, would be known as a novella. So we don't necessarily have time to read something of that particular length in our short story unit or in any of the other units that we have. So I wanted to focus on the story of an hour as an incredibly short piece, excuse me, but one that is filled with detail and with possibilities for analysis. So this life-changing hour, and this would be on page 15 of the text in which I had assigned for us, begins with knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble. And right there's so much that we can do. As many of you indicated, the Mrs. in front of the Mallard makes us think that Mrs. Mallard is viewed as a kind of possession to her husband. Upon marriage, the woman oftentimes loses her surname and takes on the surname of the male. Note that we don't hear Mrs. Mallard's first name, Louise, until later on in the story. And that is important because it's only later on in the story that she believes that she is a widow, which means that she is no longer confined into a marriage. And as many of you indicated, the idea of a mallard and that they mate, but not necessarily for life, would seem to work very nicely in this piece. Some of you also indicated that the male species of mallard is much more colorful and usually garners much more attention than the female. And that could be another way that we could make a comparison with this particular piece. Mallards are domesticated, and the idea of female being domesticated during this time period also works. And a mallard is a bird, and if you've read any of Kate Chopin's works, you'll know that she likes to use bird imagery to represent female, the bird being something that can be trapped in a cage, or in this instance, Mrs. Mallard being trapped in the home. And at that time, the home could be seen as a kind of place of entrapment, and that ultimately she could spread her wings and fly free, which is something that she begins to contemplate over the course of the story. And being told that she has heart trouble rather than being told she has heart disease is very important at the very beginning, because the heart is not just necessarily a physical organ, but it's usually associated with emotion and love. So the fact that she has heart trouble is a bit of foreshadowing for us that this is someone who is sad and someone who experiences a kind of renewal or rebirth after she finds out the news that her husband has been involved in a terrible train accident. Notice he's named Brentley right at the very beginning. And her response is, she did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once, with sudden wild abandonment, in her sister's arms. And when the storm of grief had spent itself, She went away to her room alone, and she would have no one follow her. And even that would have seemed unusual for the time period, a woman going off by herself. And there she stood facing an open window. And the window is supposed to represent opportunity, expansiveness, especially because the window is open. This is her exit into the outside world. A comfortable, roomy armchair, and that detail is also important. She could have sat on a bench, and it would have been a very different sort of feeling. Not only is it comfortable and is it roomy, in other words, that she's going to begin feeling positive things, but an armchair is generally made for one person, and the sense that now she can be independent and an individual. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. And she could see into the open square. Again, there's much more in the way of imagery that would seem to indicate a sense of expansiveness, hope, and opportunity. The tops of trees were all aquiver with new spring life. And I believe we've talked about the idea of how spring oftentimes represents hope, renewal, rebirth. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. And rain could oftentimes be seen as a negative, dark and dreary, but it can also be seen as positive because it can wash away things, and it also leads to life. Without rain, there wouldn't be any life. There was a street peddler crying his wares, and I love that turn of phrase, crying his wares, because we usually see crying in the negative, but crying can also mean just yelling out as well. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. Again, more bird imagery here. Patches of blue sky were showing through the clouds, so even though there's rain, the sun is starting to come out. And we're told that they piled one above the other in the west facing her window. Again, a piece this short, probably every little detail has some sort of significance. It's not east, it's not south, it's west. We think about some of the associations with west. The sun sets in the west, so this could be the ending of a former life for her and the beginning of a new life. We can think of westward expansion, for instance, and again, this setting out into a new frontier. She sat up with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, and a sob came into her throat. In other words, she isn't completely happy initially, so it's not fair to say that this is something that she wanted. In fact, the exact opposite. She probably never even allowed herself the opportunity to contemplate what it would be like to be single. And she was young with a calm face whose lines bespoke repression. So even though she's young, we have to wonder, why does she feel repressed? And as we continue on with the story, it has to do with the institution of marriage itself. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? She didn't know. It was too subtle and elusive to name, but she felt it creeping out of the sky. Again, creeping isn't necessarily a word that has lots of positive associations or connotations to it. Now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. And I could tell you, if we were reading a piece of formula fiction, this would be a good way to begin to describe a scene that was erotic or sexual. But that's the exact opposite. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her. She was striving to beat it back with her will. Again, this isn't necessarily something that she wants. And then she says under her breath, free, free, free. And it's pretty clear at this particular point, this is how she feels, free. She did not stop to ask if it were not a monstrous joy that held her. A clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. In other words, this isn't about morality. Is this the right way or the wrong way to feel? That what she is experiencing is a feeling, and she doesn't want to put any judgment on it. And then we're told on page 16, she knew she'd weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death. So this is a piece of evidence to show that Brentley was a good man. She refers to him as having kind, tender hands. And in fact, she did say that she loved him sometimes. And if you've ever loved somebody and been frustrated with them at the same time, perhaps you can understand that. She says that the face had never looked save with love upon her. So this isn't about Brentley mistreating her in marriage. This is about the institution of marriage repressing and oppressing. She saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. And I know that many of you had indicated in the attendance question that this would be an opportunity for her to find another mate. And my suggestion is perhaps this is an opportunity for her to not need another mate and to be able to be single. At the time, a woman needed to be married for financial security and for social status. Divorce wasn't an option. But if a woman became widowed, then ultimately, if the woman had financial resources at that point, she had status in society and economic security. And in fact, according to the statistics of the time, it was much less likely for a female to remarry when her spouse died. It was much more likely for a male to remarry when his spouse died, perhaps because of the role of female as caretaker. She opened and spread her arms out to welcome this feeling. There would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. And then my favorite line of all of the lines in here, there would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. And I'm going to repeat that. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. And up until this point, the text seems to be very much a feminist track. But this sentence expands it, that this is beyond what happens to female, and this is about the institution of marriage as a whole, and that it can be repressive to both parties in marriage. And note that marriage is represented as a heterosexual coupling, that considering the time period in which this was written, any other option probably wouldn't be something that would be considered to be socially acceptable to discuss. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. That yes, she had loved them, often she had not, and what did it matter? Again, this is not about morality or judgment. And she says free, body and soul free. And her sister comes to the door. Her sister's name is Josephine. Notice her sister gets a first name, so the assumption is that her sister is unmarried, or else she would have been a Mrs. as well. What you may or may not have noticed about the first names of both of the female characters, Josephine and Louise, both start with basically male roots. Joseph and Louis. And I think that's very deliberate, again, to reinforce this idea of male having a certain level of power and superiority during this time period. Louise opened the door, and she's drinking in the very elixir of life through that open door. And I can't help but think of the sorrowful woman who was drinking an elixir that ultimately led to the ending of her life. And even though A Sorrowful Woman was written so many years afterwards, it's very similar in many respects. And her fancy was running riot, thinking of spring days and summer days. Again, spring and summer being a representation of the height of life. She breathed a quick prayer life might be long. It was only yesterday she thought with a shudder that life might be long. Again, this is somebody who was unhappy and unfulfilled, whose lines bespoke repression. And then as she goes down the stairs, it turns out that it was a horrible accident. Or it was a horrible mistake, that there wasn't a horrible accident after all. It was Brentley Mallard who entered a little travel stain, composedly carrying his grip sack and umbrella. I love the word grip sack as well, the idea of gripping or holding something, which could be perhaps compared to the relationship he might have felt towards his very own wife. The umbrella, and perhaps he is bringing in the rain or the darkness with him. He had been far from the scene of the accident, didn't even know there'd been one. Now, there's been a lot of speculations about Richards, the family friend who basically breaks the news, and how could he have made such a mistake. But note, we get very little information about Richards. If the author wanted us to pay attention to Richards, we would have gotten information. So We can't in any way say that this was deliberate. We can't in any way say that he had some sort of ulterior motive because there's no evidence in the text to support that. That would be mere speculation. And in terms of literary analysis, you need to have specific evidence from the text in order to be able to support your position. So if you were to say that Mrs. Mallard feels free, a particular piece of evidence you could use is the exact quotation when she whispers under her breath, free, free, free. I mean, that's a direct connection to her feeling of freedom. But there are also other pieces of evidence that show or illustrate the possibility of freedom. The roomy armchair and the open window, for instance. And the last line, the twist ending. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease. Notice that they call it heart disease, while at the beginning we heard heart trouble. Of a joy that kills. Now, they had assumed that she was just overcome with happiness and that because she had heart disease that shock was too much for her and she died. And there could be some small level of truth to that because after all, she did love him sometimes. But what they don't know and what we know, because we were in that room with her when she was alone, is that she feels sadness and disappointment that her husband has returned because her opportunity for freedom and independence has been taken away from her. In some ways, you could say this is almost like a willed suicide. And again, notice the similarity with A Sorrowful Woman in that both main female characters feel trapped by their lives because of societal expectations. Both of them try to break free from those boundaries, and both of them end up dying. So, that said, I wouldn't at all be surprised if Gail Godwin had known this particular short story, which is quite famous. The Story of an Hour is part of that literary canon that we talked about, those works considered by scholars and critics worth literary study, and that would have helped inspire her in some ways. One of the reasons why I wanted you to read the story is so that you could contemplate some of the questions at the ending of the story on page 18, because these questions give you a sense of how tricky it is to analyze literature. And the questions are, did you find Mrs. Mallard a sympathetic character? Some readers think she's callous, selfish, unnatural, even monstrous, because she revels in the newly discovered sense of freedom so soon after learning of her husband's presumed death. And it's quite possible that some of you felt that way about Mrs. Mallard. Others read her as a victim of her inability to control her own life in a repressive, male-dominated society. And some of you might have felt that way. Is it possible to hold both views simultaneously? And are your views in any way influenced by your being male or female? Does your age affect your perception? And this one is particularly complex because our age is constantly changing. What about your social and economic background? Does your nationality, your race, your religion in any way shape your attitudes? Do you have particular views about the institution of marriage that inform your assessment of Mrs. Mallard's character? And I can tell you that I've always wanted to teach this story with two different groups. The first time with a group of newlyweds, and the second time with a group of newly divorced individuals. And my suspicion is that it would be a different experience, even though it's the same text, but the readers would respond differently to it because of their life experience. Have other reading experiences, perhaps a familiarity with some of Chopin's other stories, predisposed you one way or another to Mrs. Mallard? And I admitted to you that I'm familiar with some of Chopin's other works. So I'm looking for Chopin to write about the idea of female trapped in male repressive society. I'm looking for the idea of bird as symbolic of the plight of female, because this is something that Chopin oftentimes does. So basically, understanding potential influences might be useful in determining whether a particular response to Mrs. Mallard is based on the story's details and their arrangement, or some sort of a bias, whether it be overt or subtle, that is brought into the story. So you need to be careful when you're analyzing a piece of literature to make sure that you are using the evidence within the literature. But you also need to understand that there is no one definitive reading of a piece of literature. There are many different ways and many different lenses from which you can view a particular piece of literature. And while Story of an Hour has been focused, or my discussion of Story of an Hour has been focused more on marriage, we could read this piece, for instance, in terms of an examination of the medical community at the time, because after all, the doctors say that she had died of heart disease, and how little understanding they had of female and just patients in general during the time period. But considering that so much of this particular story happens to be about Mrs. Mallard and her consideration of being a widow, it would seem that Chopin wants us to think about primarily marriage and what marriage meant for female during this time period. Very similar to what Gail Godwin wanted us to consider with The Sorrowful Woman, and what it meant to be wife and mother during that time period, and what happens if one was not satisfied with those particular roles, what options, if any, would be possible. So in terms of thinking about how you could go about analyzing literature, there's a piece entitled A Rose for Emily. And one of the reasons why I had assigned this particular piece, outside of the fact that it is a short story that is also part of the literary canon, but it also includes an interview that the author gave about his particular short story. Now, this piece was written in 1931, the author being William Faulkner, and the plot is fairly simple if you understand that what we are being given is a mixed chronology. In other words, we are not told the events in the order in which they occur. Because once we put all of the events in the order in which they occur, the story almost sounds formulaic. And in fact, I will tell you the story in the order in which the events occurred, though, again, this is not the way the story is told to us. Miss Emily happens to be the daughter of a very rich and aristocratic individual in the South in the 1800s. And she is very repressed by her father. He doesn't really allow her to date. He doesn't think anybody really is good enough for her. Oh, and by the way, insanity runs in her family. And that was just a little side note. Eventually, her father dies, and she has great difficulty in accepting his death. And in fact, she holds on to the body for 3 days and refuses to let it go until she's forced to do so. And then she disappears for a good amount of time, and then she comes back with a new hairstyle and living a new life, and she begins to date now that her father isn't there. And the man she chooses is, of all people, Homer Barron. And the reason why he's so surprising is that, first of all, he's a northerner, and she's a southerner. And again, in the 1800s, that would have been hugely important. And also, or in the 1900s, I should say, that would be hugely important. And also, what is important is the fact that he is a laborer and she is a former Southern aristocrat. So the idea of these two having a relationship raises multiple eyebrows. And the community spends a good amount of time gossiping about what this might be. I say former aristocrat because it turns out that now that her father has died, while she still has title, she doesn't have money. So much so that the town even excuses her from paying her taxes by creating this long convoluted story that her father had lent money to the town and that ultimately this was their way of repaying it, so she doesn't have to pay her taxes. The story is untrue, but they say this so that she can retain her dignity and doesn't have to acknowledge the fact that now that she doesn't have the financial resources that she used to have. At any rate, she's dating Homer, and eventually she ends up going to a pharmacist and buying some arsenic. And we aren't told why she's buying the arsenic, and the pharmacist asks her why she's buying the arsenic, and she refuses to reply, even though she's required to by law. So he just writes down, well, it's for rats. And then what ends up happening is she buys a good amount of toiletries for a male, and Homer is seen entering her home. And then he disappears, never to be seen again. And after a little bit of while, a stench starts coming out of her home. But the townspeople are afraid to confront her, so they basically spread lime around the property, and they end up not confronting her. And she becomes a recluse, and there is a new generation in town, and the new generation wants her to begin paying taxes, and she refuses. In fact, she says, go talk to Colonel Sartoris, because he was the one who indicated I don't have to pay taxes. The difficulty is that Colonel Sartoris has been dead for quite a bit of time. Eventually, Miss Emily dies, and the entire community goes to her funeral more out of curiosity than anything else. And afterwards, they're able to visit her home. And what they find in the home is a locked room. And when they open up that locked room, they find, lo and behold, the corpse of Homer. And it turns out that she killed Homer and kept the body. And then the story ends with a reference to next to the body was an iron gray hair. And that's important because her hair had turned gray years after Homer was missing. In other words, she has been lying next to this body. And whatever your imagination can supply about what she was doing with this body is much worse than anything William Faulkner could offer us as readers. And that's how the story ends. And you can probably figure out with all of the details put in chronological order that she has killed Homer. And if you were able to figure it out, even when the details were not in chronological order, Faulkner gives us a second climax, hoping that while you may have figured out the first piece, you may not have figured out the second piece, that she's been lying next to the body. And that said, this piece is known as a kind of writing that is classified as Southern Gothic. And the Gothic is a literary genre that has its origins in the 1800s with some very famous texts such as Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And it's known for its use of eerie atmosphere, its use of mystery, its sense of death and decay, the sense of victimization of individual. And the Gothic tradition eventually was brought to the United States with also some famous authors, Edgar Allan Poe, for instance. And then a movement started called Southern Gothic, and that these were writers from the American South who were setting their tales in this Gothic atmosphere that was known in Britain in the Frankenstein, Dracula, Dr. Jekyll, and Mr. Hyde era. So that's one of the things that we'll see in this particular text, in that it has a good number of Gothic elements to it. But I did want to direct you to the author interview at the ending of this particular text. One thing to note about this particular interview is that it occurs years after basically the author has written his story. And that's important because when he's asked questions, I don't know if he necessarily has the memory of what he initially intended when he first constructed the story. And in fact, his answers to many of these questions seem rather flippant, whether it's because he couldn't remember or because he just didn't want to supply answers because he wanted us as readers to struggle with the text. Faulkner was also known for having a drinking problem, and I wonder sometimes how sober he was when he gave this interview. But nevertheless, on page 84, and note again, this interview was in 1959, so this is quite a bit of time after the actual story, A Rose for Emily, in 1931. The question that he's first asked makes a lot of sense from a literary perspective. What is the meaning of the title? And oftentimes the titles have significant meaning, just like I had suggested with A Sorrowful Woman. And this is Faulkner's response of what is the meaning of the title Rose for Emily. Oh, it's simply the poor woman had no life at all. Her father had kept her more or less locked up where she had a lover and was about to quit her, and she had to murder him. It was just a rose for Emily, that's all. And I don't know if that's a very satisfying answer. I know I wouldn't be very satisfied with that answer if I received this in a student paper. And next class, we're actually going to talk about other possibilities for the meaning of the title of A Rose for Emily that perhaps are better than Faulkner's explanation, as arrogant as that might sound. But that said, we have talked about that an author's perspective of a text, while it does have validity, it doesn't negate our having a different perspective as long as there's evidence in the text in order to be able to support our perspective. So then he's asked other questions, including on page 85, it's been argued that A Rose for Emily is a criticism of the North. And it's others have argued that say it's a criticism of the South. Now, could you say this is a criticism of the times? And we'll talk more about this as well next class. But since Homer is a northerner, oftentimes it's been viewed as a representation of the North infringing on the South. Or is this a criticism of the South, Miss Emily representing a fallen Southern aristocracy, that could be a representation of the dying institution of slavery? And in fact, Miss Emily does have a servant, and he is basically silent throughout the course of the text and then just disappears. And notice he's referenced as a servant. He's not referenced as a slave because slavery would be illegal at this particular point in time. And yes, the N-word is used in this story, and it is quite controversial because oftentimes the response is that it's offensive, and it is indeed. I think it's important to read a story in the time period in which it was set with the language it would have used so that we can understand the history of the time period and how ugly, honestly, the history was during this time period. But regardless of whether or not you wanted to read this story as an examination of the North or an examination of the South or an examination of the times, this is how Faulkner responds. I don't know. I was simply trying to write about people. The writer uses environment, what he knows. If there's a symbolism in which the lover represented the North and the woman who murdered him represented the South, I don't say that's not valid and not there. But it was no intention of the writer to see, now let's see. I'm going to write a piece in which I will use the symbolism for the North or another symbol for the South. That he was simply writing about people, a story which he thought was tragic and true, because it came out of the human heart, the human aspiration, the conflict of conscience with glands, with the old Adam. It was a conflict not between North and South, so much as between God and Satan. And I can say that the first time that I read that response, I stopped right there and I thought, God and Satan, I hadn't thought about that. And it seems the questioner felt the same way and asked just a little bit more on that one thing. You say it's a conflict between God and Satan. I don't quite understand what you mean. Did one represent the, and this is Faulkner's response. The conflict was in Miss Emily. She knew you do not murder people. She'd been trained that you do not take a lover. You marry, you don't take a lover. She had broken all the laws of her tradition, her background, and she had finally broken the law of God too, which says you do not take human life. So again, I don't know how satisfying these responses are. And it also occurs to me that Faulkner moves into the third person when he begins talking about himself, saying, well, I'm not saying that it was the intention of the writer to do this or intention to do that, which is always odd when someone moves into the third person. And then the end where Faulkner says that he thought of this as a ghost story, the strand of hair on the pillow of an abandoned house. That gets us back to the idea of the Gothic tradition, and I would suggest that the South being haunted by the ghosts of its past, including slavery, is something that is examined in this particular text. Especially if we talk a little bit about Faulkner's background, because he was born and raised in the South and was very clear that he felt a certain level of guilt and embarrassment over how his ancestors had treated African Americans. So this is something that we will see in his text. But I wanted to continue that next class, and I thought that what we could do for today's attendance question is see if you could identify a specific quote in A Rose for Emily that you feel has a certain level of importance, and briefly talk about why you feel it's important. Thus far, I've been leading us by pointing out particular quotes. So now I'll see how many of you can find quotes that in one way or another help you with your understanding of the reading. And that will be due on Wednesday, the 10th of February by 10 a.m. And again, if you need an extension, please let me know. What we'll do next class is put some closure on to A Rose for Emily. And we've got 3 short stories at this point to talk about, so we'll be moving a little bit more quickly. Young Goodman Brown, which is set in New England, so you can get a little bit of a sense of New England history, Massachusetts and Salem in particular. Soldier's Home, which happens to be the story about a veteran who has returned home from war. And sadly, this story is as timely as ever. And Battle Royal, which happens to be a piece from the novel Invisible Man, which, in my personal opinion, is perhaps one of the best novels ever written because it very much reads like a short story, even though it's hundreds of pages long in terms of its detail and its depth. That said, we don't have time to read a novel in its entirety, but its initial chapter, Battle Royal, first appeared as a short story, and it is indeed a battle, and it's about the story of a young protagonist, African American, in time of great racism and discrimination in the 1950s. And he's asked to deliver a speech, and he thinks it's an honor, and it's anything but, as we will see when we read the particular story. So what I will do is fill you in on what happens to him afterwards, from the novel as a whole, not that we're reading the novel, just so that you have some background with that. We'll also start talking a little bit about journals because, as you know, at the ending of the short story unit, you will be asked to write a journal where you respond to 3 of the short stories, perhaps a page or so for each of the short stories that you select. And you can refer to each short story as an independent unit, or you can deal with them as a whole and compare and contrast however you'd like. And while it's not due until the ending of our short story unit, you basically have the option of handing it in early if you so wanted to. And that will be something that's graded informally on a checkmark basis from me. And I will not read for grammar mechanics, just for content, with a plus being excellent, and a check plus being very good, and a check being good. It's where most of the grades end up, though there could be a check minus, which is less than satisfactory, or a minus, which is unsatisfactory. And I'll return those back to you, and that might help inform how you proceed with the paper, which is something else that we need to talk about over the next several classes, because eventually you'll be writing a more formal analysis to one of the short stories, approximately 4 or 5 pages or so. And I'll give you some sample topics and ideas of how to pursue that, but you can also come up with your own ideas and have them approved by me. And I will also do a review of how to write an academic paper and applying that to literature. So those are some of the things that will be coming up. But right now we are in the midst of our short story section. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about A Rose for Emily and other short stories. Take care. Bye-bye.